Hello and welcome to another HanDrinkssSolo wine info video, and today we are talking about Jordan's Real McCoy Riesling 2021 made by winemaker Shark Nelson. Jordan is laid out over a very unique little patch of land that joins two wards in Stellenbosch. On the western side you have the famous Polkadraai Hills ward, and over on the eastern and southern side you've got a delightfully tucked away little nook called Stellenbosch Kloof. Now, the unique placement of the farm means there's a huge variety of aspects from which the Jordan viticultural team have plotted and planned very carefully with regards to which cultivars should be planted where. For the most part, on the western slopes, which enjoys the slightly warmer afternoon sun, the Jordan team has planted a lot of their red cultivars, including Merlot and Syrah. Then on the eastern and southern side, which enjoys far less intense solar radiation, they've planted a lot of their white cultivars, including the Real McCoy Riesling down on some southern-facing slopes. They do also have a few slopes that face north, and on those slopes they planted things like Cabernet Sauvignon on account of how slow ripening it is, but also they've planted ASSYRTIKO, which is a Greek grape that hails from the Isle of Santorini. And Jordan are the first estate in South Africa to plant and vinify ASSYRTIKO, not least of all because of how drought resistant it is. And so this is something that they are looking to plant and grow and vinify for the future. Now, when it comes to the history of Jordan Estate, it really has only been in the family for 2 generations. It was in 1982 that Ted Jordan bought this patch of land. He'd spent 20 years building, growing, and leading the Jordan shoe factory, and then decided it was time to turn his attention to this little plot of land in Stellenbosch Kloof. And he then spent the next 10 years carefully planning and plotting and getting advice on where each patch of cultivars should go. It was 10 years later that Ted's son Gary returned from having studied winemaking and viticulture overseas in order to come back and build the cellar and really begin building the brand of Jordan wines. So why go into all this historical detail? Well, for 2 reasons. First of all, to demonstrate that Jordan really have been pioneers in the South African wine industry. I mean, most obviously with ASSYRTIKO recently, but if we look back in the history, we see they were also one of the founding members of the South African Riesling Association called Just Riesling. And the second reason that we go into the detail is to show you that because they planned and plotted so carefully 30 or 40 years ago, we now have an estate that is chock-a-block full of certified heritage vineyards. Because they were carefully planted when they began, the vines didn't need to be pulled up or changed or replanted, and so you've got this glut of old vines. The relevance of those old vines becomes immediately apparent when we turn our attentions back to the wine of the day, the Jordan Real McCoy Riesling 2021. Because the fruit for this wine was harvested from vines that are 36 years old. But that's not all. They also planted at a delightful altitude of 300 meters above sea level. So there's that lovely increased diurnal range. After that, we note that it's on the southern facing slope, which means that it has a much, much lower level of solar radiation. Now, this is good for white cultivars in general, but in particular for Riesling, because in Riesling, high solar radiation levels translate into high levels of chemical precursors that, once it's gone through fermentation, will end up creating the building blocks for TDN, or that kerosene note in Riesling. And modern Riesling makers are looking to avoid that smoky kerosene note as much as possible. So this little high altitude slope with low solar radiation is the perfect spot to plant South African Riesling. At this point, you might ask, well, if it doesn't smell of kerosene, then what does it smell of? Well, let's get into the glass. Well, the nose really is, as promised, delightfully fresh and clean and primary. There are some lovely lime cordial notes, notes of orange rind, and then there's this really vivid Granny Smith green apple juice / apple skin aroma that is coming out of the glass. It is worth noting that the wine is fermented in stainless steel and there's no oak anywhere in the process, so you won't get those oak spice or smoke elements, but there is that hint of lovely sort of beeswax that goes on. And I guess that is in the same zone as the kerosene or the TDN, but it's so subtle that it just serves as a bit of garnish over the fruit. When we take a sip, well, the freshness and the vibrance that was promised on the nose really does follow through. You have this beautifully vivid, crisp, tart Granny Smith green apple. You have some of the orange rind, and you also have some sweeter lime cordial note that really rounds out the bright acid from the apples. It's just incredibly intense and lengthy. That tail just goes and goes and goes. a truly classy expression of South African Riesling from one of Stellenbosch's cooler little nooks. That's all we have time for today, but if you enjoyed today's video, then support us on Patreon and subscribe to the HanDrinkssSolo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month covering things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars coming out of the dynamic South African winelands.